June 10th, 323 BC Babylon. The greatest conqueror the world had ever seen lay on his deathbed, burning with fever. He was 32 years old. In 13 years, he had marched his army from Macedonia to Egypt, from Persia to the edge of India, an empire stretching over 2 million square miles, built faster than any in history, before or since. His men had walked more than 20,000 miles on foot. They had crossed deserts that killed by day and mountains that killed by night. They had never lost a single battle, and now their king was dying of a fever in a palace in Babylon. Nobody knows exactly what killed him. The ancient sources say he collapsed after a drinking party and never recovered, burning with a slow, relentless fever for 12 agonizing days. Modern medical researchers publishing in peer-reviewed journals have proposed typhoid fever, malaria, West Nile virus, and even Guillain-Barré syndrome. A University of Maryland medical board settled on typhoid fever as the most likely diagnosis. Others argue he was poisoned that his own generals, exhausted and afraid of where he would lead them next, finally decided that only death could stop him. Whatever killed him, the moment he died, the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen began to tear itself apart. But what if the fever broke? What if the king survived, recovered, and rose from that bed in Babylon with 30 or 40 more years ahead of him? The first thing you need to understand is that Alexander was not finished, not even close. At the time of his death, he had assembled a fleet of 1,000 warships and a reorganized army of hundreds of thousands of men. He had specific, documented plans for what came next. Arabia was first the wealthy peninsula that controlled the spice trade and had so far escaped conquest entirely. After Arabia, the ancient sources describe plans for campaigns along the entire North African coast. Then Carthage, the great maritime power that dominated the western Mediterranean. Then the Greek colonies of Sicily and southern Italy. And then, in a move that would have changed everything, Rome. One Oxford University historian writing on the subject stated flatly that Alexander had been poised to effectuate the conquests of Arabia, North Africa, and Western Europe with a fleet of 1,000 galleys and a vast battle-hardened army, and that it was most unlikely that anything else could have stopped him. Let that land for a moment. Rome, the city that would build an empire lasting 1,000 years, the city whose law, language, and political philosophy still echoes through every Western democracy alive today, was, in 323 BC, a regional power of modest importance in central Italy. Its legions were formidable, but they had never faced anything like Alexander's army. In the same year Alexander died, the Romans were still fighting local Italian tribes. They had not yet conquered the peninsula they stood on. The Roman historian Livy, writing centuries later, actually posed this exact question: what would have happened if Alexander had marched west against Rome? He concluded with patriotic confidence that Rome would have won. But almost every modern military historian who has examined the matchup disagrees. Alexander's combined arms system, heavy Macedonian phalanx infantry, working alongside the most mobile and devastating cavalry force the ancient world had ever produced, had dismantled every army it ever faced. The Persian Empire, the largest state in the world, fell in 3 pitched battles. There is no compelling reason to think Rome in 323 BC would have fared better. A living Alexander conquers Rome, and in doing so erases the city that would otherwise shape the next 2,000 years of Western civilization. Roman law, which forms the bedrock of most modern legal systems, gets replaced by something Macedonian and Greek. The Roman Republic, the model of government that the American founders explicitly studied and referenced when writing the Constitution, never matures into the empire that spread it across Europe. Latin, the language that evolved into French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, never becomes a lingua franca. The entire linguistic map of the Western world is unrecognizable, but the consequences reach further than Europe. Alexander's conquests didn't just move armies, they moved ideas. The period historians call the Hellenistic Age, which began after his death and lasted for roughly 3 centuries, was one of the most intellectually explosive eras in human history. Greek philosophy, science, and culture fused with Persian, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Indian traditions. The Library of Alexandria was built in this period. Euclid wrote his geometry. Archimedes worked out the principles of the lever and the screw. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth accurately more than 1,700 years before Columbus sailed west. The Hellenistic world was, in many ways, on the edge of a scientific revolution. It got disrupted, fragmented, and eventually overwhelmed by Rome. A living Alexander ruling a unified empire from Babylon to Carthage to the borders of India doesn't fragment. The intellectual cross-pollination continues. The Library of Alexandria doesn't just survive, it expands. And it does so under the patronage of an empire that has access to Indian mathematics, Persian astronomy, and Greek philosophy simultaneously. Some historians have argued seriously that a surviving Hellenistic empire could have triggered something resembling a scientific and industrial revolution well over 1,000 years before it happened in 18th century Britain. That is not a small claim. If true, it means the world of today is not a world of smartphones and space stations and modern medicine. It is a world so far ahead of what we know that we cannot even imagine it accurately. Then there is the question of religion. Jesus of Nazareth was born in a Roman province, in a Roman-dominated world, and Christianity spread through the Roman Empire's infrastructure, its roads, its legal tolerance in specific periods, and eventually its official endorsement under Constantine. Without Rome, the conditions that allowed Christianity to become a global religion are completely different. A Hellenistic empire ruled from Babylon, religiously diverse and philosophically eclectic, may have produced a world where dozens of religious traditions developed in parallel, where no single faith captured the allegiance of an entire civilization in the way Christianity eventually did in the West, and Islam eventually did in the Middle East. The absence of those two religions, which between them shaped the last 2,000 years of global history, every crusade, every jihad, every reformation, every religious war in Europe, every conflict in the modern Middle East is almost impossible to process. A world without the religious architecture those faiths built is not merely different. It is a different species of civilization entirely. And yet here is the counter-argument that every honest historian has to acknowledge. Empires do not survive on the strength of one man. The history of enormous personal empires is almost uniformly the same: extraordinary conquest, chaotic succession, rapid fragmentation. Alexander's own generals, even while he lived, were growing resentful. His Macedonian officers mutinied at the Hyphasis River in India, refusing to march further east. His adoption of Persian customs, wearing Persian dress, demanding the prostration ritual that Greeks reserved for gods, had caused a near revolt within his own court. Some historians believe the most likely scenario in a longer-lived Alexander is not a unified world empire, but a prolonged series of internal wars, as his own officers and administrators fought over power and territory. One scholar put it with uncomfortable precision. Having turned Alexander back from the east by mutiny, his officers may have felt that only death could stop him from taking them into another impossible war in the west. If so, they may have helped it along. The greatest conqueror in history may have been destroyed not by a fever, but by the limits of what human beings will endure for one man's ambition, no matter how brilliant that man was. What does that tell us? Perhaps that the most important force in history is not the genius of exceptional individuals. Perhaps it is the point at which ordinary people decide they have had enough. Alexander reached that point at 32, and the world has been living with the consequences ever since. If Alexander had lived and conquered Rome, do you think Western civilization would be better or worse today? Leave your answer below.